Magic and Mystery in Tibet by Alexandra David-Neel. Chapter 1. Tibet and the Lamas. Well then, it is understood. I leave Dawasandap with you as interpreter. He will accompany you to Gangtok. Is it a man who is speaking to me? This short, yellow-skinned being clad in a robe of orange brocade, a diamond star sparkling on his hat. Is he not rather a genie come down from the neighboring mountains? They say he is an incarnated Lama and heir prince of the Himalayan throne, but I doubt his reality. Probably he will vanish like a mirage, and his caparisoned little steed and his party of followers dressed in all the colors of the rainbow. He is a part of the enchantment in which I have lived these last 15 days. This new episode is of the stuff that dreams are made of. In a few minutes I shall wake up in a real bed in some country not haunted by genii nor by incarnated lamas, wrapped in shimmering silk, a country where men wear ugly dark coats and the horses do not carry silver inlaid saddles on golden yellow cloths. The sound of kettle drum makes me start. Two Hote boys, Hote, H-A-U-T, two Hote boys, intone a melancholy minor tune. The youthful genie straddles his diminutive courser. Knights and squires jump up into their saddles. I shall expect you, the Lama Prince says, smiling graciously at me. I hear myself, if I were listening to some other person, promising that I will start the next day for his capital, and the little troop headed by the musicians disappears. As the last murmurs of the plaintive melody die away in the distance, the enchantment that has held me spellbound dissipates. I have not been dreaming. All this is real. I am at Kalimpong, Kalimpong, in the Himalayas, and the interpreter given me when I arrived stands by my side. I have already related the circumstances which had brought me to the Himalayas. Political reasons had at that time led the Dalai Lama to seek refuge in British territory. It had seemed to me a unique opportunity, while he was stopping at the Indian frontier, of obtaining an interview and getting information from him about the special type of Buddhism that prevails in Tibet. Very few strangers have ever approached the monk king hidden in his sacred city in the land of snows. Even in exile he saw no one. Up to the time of my visit, he had obstinately refused an audience to any woman except Tibetans, and I believe even to this day that I am the only exception to this rule. As I left Darjeeling in the early rosy dawn of a cool spring morning, I little guessed the far-reaching consequences of my request. I thought of a short excursion, of an interesting but brief interview, while actually I had become involved in wanderings that kept me in Asia for a full 14 years. At the beginning of that long series of journeys, the Dalai Lama figures in my diaries as an obliging host who, seeing a friend without the walls, invites him to see over his domain. This the Dalai Lama did in a few words. Quote, "Learn the Tibetan language," end quote, he told me. If one could believe his subjects who call him the Omniscient, the sovereign of Tibet, when giving me this advice, foresaw its consequences and consciously directed me not only towards Lhasa for his forbidden capital, but towards the mystic masters and the unknown magicians, yet more closely hidden in his wonderland. At Kalimpong, the Lama king lived in a large house belonging to the minister of Raja of Bhutan. To give the place a more majestic appearance, 2 rows of tall bamboo poles had been planted in the form of an avenue. Flags flew from every pole, and the inscription Om Mani Padma Hum, or the horse of the air, surrounded the magic formulas. Excuse me. The suite of the exiled sovereign was numerous and included more than 100 servants. They were for the most part engaged in interminable gossip, and quiet reigned around the habitation. But on fete days, F-E-T-E, with a circumflex over the first E, but on fete days, or when visitors of rank were to be received, a crowd of busy officials and domestics poured out from all sides, peering at one from every window, crossing and recrossing the large plot of ground in front of the house, hurrying, screaming, agitated, and also remarkably alike in their dirty, greasy robes that a stranger would easily mistake awkward mistakes about their rank. The splendor, decorum, and etiquette of the Potala were absent in the land of exile. Those who saw this roadside camp, where the head of the Tibetan theocracy waited for his subjects to reconquer his throne, could not imagine that the court at Lhasa, what the court of Lhasa was like. The British expedition penetrating into the forbidden territory and parading his capital in spite of the sorcery of the most famous magicians had probably led the Dalai Lama to understand that foreign barbarians were masters in a material sense. By right of force, the inventions that he noticed during his trip through India must also have convinced him of their ability to enslave and mold the material elements of nature. But his conviction that the white race is mentally inferior remained unshaken, and in this he only shared the opinion of all Asiatics, from Ceylon to the northern confines of Mongolia. A Western woman acquainted with Buddhist doctrines seemed to him an inconceivable phenomenon. If I had vanished into space while talking to him, he would have been less astonished. My reality surprised him most, but when, finally convinced, he politely inquired after my master in quotes, assuming that I could only have learned of Buddha from an Asiatic, it was not easy to convince him that the Tibetan text of one of the most esteemed Buddhist books had been translated into French before I was born. "Ah, well," he murmured at last, "if a few strangers have really learned our language and read our sacred books, they must have missed the meaning of them." This was my chance. I hastened to seize it. It is precisely because I suspect that certain religious doctrines of Tibet have been misunderstood that I have come to you to be enlightened, I said. Excuse me. My reply pleased the Dalai Lama. He readily answered any questions I put to him, and a little later he gave me a long written explanation of the various subjects we had discussed. The Prince of Sikkim, Sikkim, and his escort having disappeared, it only remained for me to keep my promise and to make ready to start for Gangtok. But there was something to be seen before moving on. The evening before, I had witnessed the benediction of the pilgrims by the Dalai Lama, a widely different scene from the pontifical benediction at Rome. For the Pope, in a single gesture, blesses the multitude, while the Tibetans are far more exacting and each expect an individual blessing. Among Lamaists, again, the manner of the blessing varies with the social rank of the blessed. The Lama places both hands on the heads of those he most respects. In other cases, only one hand, 2 fingers, or only 1 finger. Lastly comes the blessing, given by slightly touching the head with colored ribbons attached to a short stick. In every case, however, there is contact, direct or indirect, between the Lama and the devotee. This contact, according to Lamaists, is indispensable because the benediction, whether of people or of things, is not meant to call down upon them the benediction of God, but to infuse into them some beneficial power that emanates from the Lama. The large number of people who came to Kalimpong to be touched by the Dalai Lama gave me some idea of his widespread prestige. The procession took several hours to pass before him, and I noticed not only Lamaists, but many people from Nepal and from Bengal belonging to Hindu sects had joined the crowd. I saw some who had come only to look on, suddenly seized by an occult fervor, hurrying to join the pious flock. As I was watching the scene, my eyes fell upon a man seated on the ground a little to one side. His matted hair was wound around his head like a turban, in the style common to Hindu aesthetics. Yet his features were not those of an Indian, and he was wearing dirty and much torn Lamaist monastic garments. This tramp had placed a small bag beside him and seemed to observe the crowd with a cynical expression. I pointed him out to Dawasanda, asking him if he had any idea who this Himalayan Diogenes might be. It must be a traveling Naljorpa, 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 he answered. And seeing my curiosity, my obliging interpreter went to the man and entered into conversation with him. He returned to me with a serious face and said, "This Lama is a peripatetic ascetic from Bhutan. He lives here and there in caves, empty houses, or under the trees. He has been stopping for several days in a small monastery near here." My thoughts returned to the vagabond when the prince and his escort had disappeared. I had no definite plan for the afternoon. Why should I not go to the Gompa monastery where he was staying and persuade him to talk? Was he really mocking, as he seemed to be, at the Dalai Lama and the faithful? And if so, why? There might be interesting reasons. I communicated my desire to Dawaswandap, who agreed to accompany me. We went on horseback, and we soon reached the Gompa, which was only a large-sized country house. In the La Kang, in brackets, the room containing the holy images. Let me spell that for you. Lhakang. Okay. In the La Kang, we found the Naljorpa seated upon a cushion in front of the low table, finishing his meal. Cushions were brought, and we were offered tea. It was difficult to begin a conversation with the ascetic, as his mouth appeared to be full of rice. He had only answered our polite greetings by a kind of grunt. I was trying to find a phrase to break the ice when the strange fellow began to laugh and muttered a few words. Dawasandap seemed embarrassed. "What does he say?" I asked. "Excuse me," answered the interpreter. "These Naljarapas sometimes speak roughly. I do not know if I should translate." "Please do," I replied. "I'm here to take notes, especially of anything at all curious and original." Well then, excuse me, he said. What is this idiot here for? Such rudeness did not greatly astonish me, as in India, also certain yogins make a habit of insulting anyone who approaches them. Tell him, I have come to ask why he mocked at the crowd seeking the benediction of the Dalai Lama. Puffed up with a sense of their own importance and the importance of what they are doing, insects fluttering in the dung, muttered the Darjurpa between his teeth. This was vague, but the kind of language one expects from such men. And you, I replied, are you free from all the defilement? He laughed noisily. He who tries to get out only sinks in deeper. I roll in it like a pig. I digest it. I turn it into golden dust, into the brook of pure water, to fashion stars out of dog dung. That is the great work. Evidently, my friend was enjoying himself. This was his way of posing as a Superman. Are these pilgrims not right to profit by the presence of the Dalai Lama and obtain his blessing? Are they simply folk incapable of aspiring to the knowledge of the higher doctrines? But the Naljorpa interrupted me. For a blessing to be efficacious, he who gives it must possess the power that he professes to communicate. Would the precious protector, the Dalai Lama, need soldiers to fight the Chinese or other enemies if he possessed such a power? Could he not drive anyone he liked out of the country and surround Tibet with an invisible barrier that none could pass? The Guru, who is born in a lotus, had such power, and his blessing still reaches those who worship him, even though he lives in the distant land of Rakshasas. Rakshasas. I am only a humble disciple, and yet... It appeared to me that the humble disciple was maybe a little mad, and certainly very conceited, for his "and yet" had been accompanied by a glance that suggested many things. My interpreter, meantime, was visibly uneasy. He profoundly respected the Dalai Lama and disliked to hear him criticized. On the other hand, the man who could create stars out of dog dung inspired him with superstitious fear. I proposed to leave, but as I understood that the Lama was going away the next morning, I handed Dawasandap a few rupees for the traveler to help him on his way. This present displeased the Naljorpa. He refused it, saying he had already received more provisions than he could carry. Dawasandap thought it right to insist. He took a few steps forward, intending to place the money on a table near the Lama. Then I saw him stagger, fall backward, and strike his back against the wall as if he had been violently punched. He uttered a cry and clutched his stomach. The Naljorpa got up and, sneering, left the room. I feel as if I'd received a terrible blow, said Dawasandap. The Lama is irritated. How shall we appease him? Let us go, I answered. The Lama has probably nothing to do with it. You, perhaps, have heart trouble and had better consult a doctor. Pale and troubled, the interpreter answered nothing. Indeed, there was nothing to be said. We returned, but I was not able to reassure him. The next day, Dawasandap and I left for Gangtok. The mule path that we followed dives right into the Himalayas, the sacred land which the ancient Indian traditions people with famous sages, stern magicians, Aztecs, and deities. Let me read that sentence again. The mule path that we followed dives right into the Himalayas, the sacred land which ancient Indian traditions people with famous sages, stern magicians, ascetics, and deities. The summer resorts established by foreigners on the border of these impressive highlands have not yet modified their aspect. A few miles away from the hotels where the Western world enjoys dancing and jazz bands, the primeval forest reigns, shrouded in the moving fogs, a fantastic army of trees draped in livid green moss seems to keep watch along the narrow tracks, warning or threatening the traveler with enigmatic gestures. From the low valleys buried under the exuberant jungle to the mountain summits covered with eternal snow, the whole country is bathed in occult influences. In such scenery, it is fitting that sorcery should hold sway. The so-called Buddhist population is practically shamanist. And a large number of mediums, bonpos, pawas, bunting, and yabas of both sexes, even the smallest hamlets, transmit the messages of gods, demons, and the dead. I slept on the way at Pakyong, Pakyong, and the next day I reached Gangtok. As I neared this village capital, I was greeted by a sudden and formidable hailstorm. Tibetans think that meteorological phenomena are the work of demons or magicians. A hailstorm is one of their favorite weapons. The former use it to hinder pilgrims on their journey to holy places, and the latter, by this means, defend their hermitages against intruders and keep off faint-hearted candidates for discipleship. A few weeks after my arrival, the superstitious Dawasandap confessed that he had consulted a Mopa, M-O-P-A, which is a diviner, about the unexpected attack of hail upon the otherwise gloriously sunny day of my arrival. This oracle declared that the local gods and the holy lamas were not hostile to me, but that nevertheless I should meet with many difficulties if I attempted to live in the land of the religion, as Tibetans called their country. A prediction very generously fulfilled. His Highness Sidkyong Namgyal, Sidkeong Namgyal, hereditary prince of Sikkim, was a veritable lama, abbot of a monastery of the Karma Kangud sect, with a tulka, Tulku, believed to be the reincarnation of his uncle, a lama of saintly memory. As usual, he had donned a monastic garb while still a child, and spent a part of his youth in the monastery of which he was now the head. The British government having chosen him, in preference to his elder brother, a successor to the Maharaja, his father, he was put in charge of an anglicized Indian as guardian and teacher. A short stay at Oxford and a trip around the world completed his heterogeneous education. Sidkyong Tulka knew English better than his mother tongue. Tibetan his mother tongue Tibetan. He spoke Hindustani fluently and also a little Chinese. The private villa he had built in his father's gardens resembled an English country house imposed on a Tibetan temple. The same contrasts were repeated within. The ground floor was furnished according to English taste, while upstairs there was an oratory with Lamist images and a Tibetan sitting room. The young prince was very open-minded. He immediately became interested in my researches and facilitated my task with great zeal. The first part of my stay in Sikkim was devoted to visiting the monasteries scattered through the forests. Picturesquely situated, usually on the spur of a mountain, their aspect impressed me deeply. I like to imagine these rustic dwellings inhabited by thinkers liberated from worldly ambitions and struggles, who pass their days in peace and deep meditations. I did not, however, find the monasteries quite what I expected. The monks of Sikkim are, for the most part, illiterate and have no desire to be enlightened, even about the Buddhism which they profess, nor indeed have they the necessary leisure. The Gompas of Sikkim are poor. They have but a very small income and no rich benefactors. Their trapas are compelled to work for their living. Foreign authors call all members of the Lamastic clergy indiscriminately lamas, but this is not the custom in Tibet. The only monks who have the right to the title of lama are the ecclesiastical dignitaries such as the tulkas, the abbots of the large monasteries, the heads of the great monastic colleges, and monks who hold high university degrees. All other monks, even those who have been ordained as galong, are called trapas, students. Nevertheless, it is usual to give the courtesy title of lama to aged and learned monks when addressing them. In Sikkim, the number of trapas, whom the colleagues held to be learned men, were capable of celebrating a few religious rites. They taught the novices to recite the liturgy and received as fees, gifts in kind, more rarely a little money, and often merely the domestic service of their pupils. However, the exercise of their priestly functions was the main source of their income. Orthodox Buddhism strictly forbids religious rites, and learned lamas acknowledge that they cannot bestow spiritual enlightenment, which can only be acquired by personal intellectual effort. Yet the majority believe in the efficacy of certain ritualistic methods of the healing of the sick, securing material prosperity, the conquest of evil beings, and the guidance of the spirits of the dead in the other world. The funeral ceremonies were the principal duty of the Himalayan monks. They celebrated these rites with zeal, even with pleasure, for they include 1 or 2 banquets offered by the family of the dead to the monks of the monastery to which they had been attached. The officiating trapas also received presents of money and in kind at the house of the dead man. Now, the peasant clergy of these forests are generally poor and ill-fed, and it's difficult for them to suppress a thrill of delight when the death of a rich villager promises them several days' feasts. Grown-up men usually dissimulate their feelings, but the child novices who guard the cattle in the woods are amusingly frank. One day, while I was sitting not far from some of these youthful herdsmen, a far-off sound of wind instruments reached us. Wind instruments reached us. In an instant, The boys who'd been playing stopped, listened attentively, and again we heard the same sound, and the children had understood. "The conscious," said one of them. "Someone is dead," answered another. Then they kept silent, looking at each other, their eyes sparkling with pleasure. "We shall have meat to eat," one of the boys whispered. In many villages, the Lama as priest comes into competition with a sorcerer, though as a rule this leads to no animosity. Generally, each has more or less faith in the worth of his rival's methods. Although the Lama is held in higher esteem than the bone sorcerer, a follower of the ancient religion of the Aborigines, or than the Nagspa, Ngagspa, magician, assimilated to the official clergy, these latter are nevertheless believed to be more skillful in dealing with the demons who harm living beings or the spirits of the dead. An unforeseen incident led me to discover how the spirit of the dead man is drawn out of the body by the officiating Lama and directed on the right road in the next world. I was returning that day from an excursion in the forest when I heard a sharp, brief cry, unlike any animal known to me. A few minutes later, the same cry was twice repeated. I advanced slowly and noiselessly in the direction of the sound, and I discovered a cabin which had been hidden by the slight rise in the ground. Lying flat between the bushes, I could observe what was going on without being seen. 2 monks were seated under the trees, their gaze lowered in an attitude of meditation. "Hik!" H-I-K, cried one upon a peculiar abnormal thrill note. "Hik!" repeated the other after a few minutes, and so they continued, with long intervals of silence, during which they remained motionless between the shrieks. I noticed that a great effort seemed to be required to produce this sound, which apparently came up from their very entrails. After having watched them for some time, I saw one of the Trappas put his hands upon his throat. His face expressed suffering. He turned his head to one side and spat out a stream of blood. His companion said a few words that I could not hear. Without answering, the monk rose and went towards the cabin. Then I noticed a long straw standing straight up on the top of his head. What did this ornament signify? While the Trappa entered the hut and his friend had his back to me, I escaped. As soon as I saw Dawaswandap, I questioned him. What were these men doing? Why did they utter this strange cry? That, he said, is the ritualistic cry that the officiating Lama shouts beside a person who has just died in order to free the spirit and cause it to leave the body through a hole that this magic syllable opens in the summit of the skull. Only a Lama who has received from a competent master the power of uttering that hik with the right intonation and the required force is capable of success. After hik, he shouts fat. But he must be careful not to articulate fat when he is only practicing like the monks you overheard. The combination of these 2 sounds invariably leads to the separation of the body and the spirit, so that the Lama, who pronounced them correctly over himself, would immediately die. This danger does not exist when he is officiating, because he acts by proxy in place of the dead, lending him his voice, so that the effect of the magic words is felt by the dead man, not by the Lama. Once the psychic power of drawing the spirit out of the corporeal envelope has been conferred by a competent master upon a disciple, The latter must practice the uttering of hik in the right tone. It is known that this has been attained when a straw stuck in the skull stands up straight as long as desired. For by shouting hik, a slight opening in the skull is produced and the straw is placed in it. In the case of a dead man, the opening is much larger. It is sometimes large enough to introduce a little finger. Dawaswant Dawasandap was much interested in all questions concerning death and the spirit world. 5 or 6 years after I knew him, he translated a classic Tibetan work on the peregrinations of the dead in the next world. Several foreigners, Oriental scholars, or British officials have employed Dawasandap and acknowledged his ability. However, I have good reason to think that none of them knew the real peculiarities of this character as I did. Dawasandap was an occultist, and even in a certain way a mystic. He sought for secret intercourse with the Dakinis and dreadful gods, hoping to gain supernatural powers. Everything that concerned the mysterious world of beings, generally invisible, strongly attracted him, but the necessity of earning his living made it impossible for him to devote much time to his favorite study. Born at Kalimpong, his ancestors were hillmen, Bhutanis, or Sikhimesis, from the Tibetan stock of the invaders. He got a scholarship and was educated at the high school of Darjeeling, established for young men of Tibetan origin. He entered the British government service in India and became interpreter at Baxduar, Baxeduar, on the southern frontier of Bhutan. There he met the Lama, whom he chose for a spiritual guide. I got some idea of this teacher from the accounts of Dawasandap, who venerated him deeply. He must have resembled many lamas whom I have met later on, harboring in his mind a mixture of learning and superstitions, but above all a good and charitable man. He was distinguished from his colleagues, however, by having had as master a veritable saint whose death is worth relating. This holy Lama was an anchorite who practiced mystic contemplation in a secluded spot in Bhutan. As it is often the case, one of his disciples shared his hermitage and served him. One day, a pious benefactor came to see the ascetic and left him a sum of money to purchase winter provisions. His disciple, urged on by covetousness, stabbed him and ran off with the silver. The aged Lama was still alive and came to his senses soon after the murderer had gone. His wounds caused him excruciating suffering, and to escape this torture he sank into meditation. Concentration of thought is carried so far by Tibetan mystics that it becomes an aesthetic, and they do not feel anything, or at lower degree of power they can thus greatly lessen their pains. When another disciple of the Lama went to visit him a few days later, he found him rolled up in a blanket and motionless. The smell from the festering wounds and the blood-stained blanket brought his attention. He questioned the master. The hermit then told him what had happened, and when the man wished to get a doctor from the nearest monastery, he was forbidden to do so. If the lamas and the villagers happen to hear about my condition, they will search for the culprit, said the ascetic. He cannot have gone far. They would find him and probably condemn him to death. I cannot permit this. I wish to give him more time to escape. One day he will perhaps return to the right path, and in any case I shall not have been the cause of his death. So do not tell anyone that you have seen me here. Now go, leave me alone. While I meditate, I do not suffer, but when I become conscious of my body, my pain is unbearable. An Oriental disciple does not discuss an order of this kind. The man prostrated himself at his guru's feet and left. A few days later, the hermit, all alone in his hut, passed away. Although Dawasanda greatly admired the conduct of the Holy Lama, such moral summits were not for him. He humbly confessed it. Drink, a failing frequent among his countrymen, had been the curse of his life. This increased his natural tendency to anger and led him one day within an ace of murder. I had some influence over him while I lived in Gangtok. I persuaded him to promise the total abstinence from fermented beverages that is enjoined on all Buddhists, but it needed more energy than he possessed to persevere. It was impossible for him to resist his surroundings. Where men say that to drink and leave one's reason at the bottom of the cup is the proper thing for a faithful principle of for a faithful disciple of Padmasambhava, Padmasambhava. When I met Dawasanda, he had left the government service to become headmaster of the Tibetan school of Gangtok. He was too extraordinary for words in this role. His passion for reading literally tyrannized the man. Wherever he went, he carried a book with him, and absorbed in it, he lost himself in a kind of ecstasy. For hours he would forget where he was. He learned translations, his long conversations with Lama, his learned translations, his long conversations with lamas, and the celebrating of occult rites constantly distracted him from attending to his school. Indeed, he often seemed to have forgotten its very existence. Sometimes for a whole month he did not set foot in the schoolroom, abandoning his scholars to the care of the undermaster, who followed his example in neglecting them as far as he dared without risking his job. Left to themselves, the boys played and wandered in the woods, forgetting the little they had learned. However, the day would come when Dawasanda, severe as a judge of the dead, suddenly appeared before his pupils, who trembled in every limb, knowing full well what they had to expect. First, they had to stand in line in front of their examiner, who then questioned a boy one at a time, or at the other end of the line. Questioned a boy at one or the other end of the line. If the child gave an incorrect answer or none at all, his comrade next in line might answer, and if his solution was right, he was ordered to slap the ignorant in the face and take his place. The victim was again questioned. If he did not show more learning than the first time, the third in line was called up, and if successful, would be told to slap his comrade and take his place. An unlucky urchin, stupefied by all these repeated brutalities, reached the end of the row, having received a dozen blows. Not infrequently it happened that several boys, standing side by side, were incapable of reciting their lessons. In that case, the most erudite of the group distributed all the slaps, and if all the children showed themselves equally ignorant, Dawaswant himself chastised them all. Certain pupils hesitated to give a friend a hard blow and only made a pretense of striking him, but Dawasandap was on the lookout. "Come up here," he would say with a little ferocious laugh. "You do not know how it is done, my boy. I will teach you." And bang, his large hand would strike the poor lad full in the face, and then the boy had to demonstrate on his friend's cheek that he had learned his lesson, clearly given by this terrible teacher. Sometimes the faults to be punished were not connected with the pupil's work. In that strange school, devoid of all discipline, the inventive mind of Dawasandap discovered transgressions to rules which had never been made. In these cases, he used a specially long and heavy stick, ordering the culprit to stretch out his arm and keep his hand open. Then the boy received on his palm a number of strokes fixed by the master. As he maneuvered his weapon, Dawasandap executed a kind of savage war dance, marking each stroke with a leap and a wild exclamation of "Han!" So, with the active, though unwilling, cooperation of the victim, whose pain caused him to stamp, writhe, and yell, the punishment looked like a devilish ballet. Arriving unexpectedly at the school one day, I witnessed one of these scenes, and the children who became familiar with me frankly described their teacher's educational methods. After a few days of this active professorship, Dawasandap would again abandon his pupils. I could tell many other stories about my good interpreter, some quite amusing in the style of Boccaccio. He played other parts other than those of occultist, schoolmaster, and writer. But peace to his memory, I do not wish to belittle him, having acquired real erudition by persevering efforts. He was sympathetic and interesting. I congratulate myself on having met him and gratefully acknowledge my debt to him. I may add that Dawasandap is the author of the first and up to now the only English Tibetan dictionary, and that he ended his days as professor of Tibetan at the University of Calcutta. And I'm going to pause here, and this is about halfway through the first chapter. I hope you found that interesting. Magic and mystery in Tibet. Wow. Yes, I know this is going to be very interesting. So I hope you'll come back, and please subscribe, and please click the like button, and any comments, leave below. I will read them all. Thanks. Till soon.